Paris, late 16th century. The streets were restless, the air thick with the scent of smoke, fear, and incense. France was a nation torn apart by religious wars, a kingdom teetering between faith and fire. And at the very heart of this maelstrom stood a queen mother draped in black, whispered about as both savior and serpent. Her name was Catherine de Medici. To her allies, she was a shrewd stateswoman, a woman of steel holding together a crumbling monarchy during one of Europe's darkest centuries. To her enemies, she was something far more sinister, the Black Queen, accused of poisoning rivals with hidden vials, of consorting with astrologers and necromancers, of orchestrating massacres that drenched Paris in blood. In her lifetime, Catherine outlived her husband, King Henri II, and placed not one but 3 sons upon the French throne. She ruled from the shadows, pulling the strings of kings who were too young, too weak, or too indecisive to rule alone. And yet, her reign would forever be stained with the events of August 24th, 1572, the night of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, when thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered in the streets of Paris. Was it her order that unleashed the carnage? Or was she merely caught in a tide of violence she could not control? History still argues, but her name is forever linked to that river of blood. The image of Catherine is one born of contradiction. She was a woman who loved luxury, but lived in constant fear of poverty, who was born a Medici, one of the richest families in Italy, but who entered France with no dowry to secure her place. She employed alchemists and consulted Nostradamus himself, believing in the power of stars and prophecies, yet she maneuvered through politics with cold pragmatism. She was called mother, queen, witch, poisoner, and prophetess, all in the same breath. Imagine the candlelit corridors of the Louvre, where whispers of conspiracy mixed with the scent of burning wax. Imagine Catherine, veiled in black, her fingers heavy with jeweled rings said to contain hidden chambers for venom. Imagine her private chambers, where Nostradamus unrolled charts of the heavens, foretelling the destinies of her sons. History has turned these images into legend, but behind the legend stood a woman who would do anything to preserve her dynasty in a kingdom crumbling into chaos. This is not just the story of a queen. It is the story of a survivor who clawed her way from obscurity to power, who navigated betrayal, bloodshed, and prophecy. A woman vilified as the Black Widow of France, yet one without whom the Valois dynasty might have collapsed far earlier. The tale of Catherine de Medici is one soaked in shadows, a symphony of poison, prophecy, and power. And to understand her, we must return to the beginning, not to Paris, but to Florence, where the Medici name was both a blessing and a curse, and where a girl named Caterina Maria Romola was born into a destiny more terrible and magnificent than she could ever have imagined. Caterina Maria Romola di Lorenzo de' Medici was born in Florence in 1519, a city that pulsed with both the brilliance of the Renaissance and the shadow of constant political upheaval. She entered the world not in triumph, but in tragedy. Her mother, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, died just days after giving birth. Her father, Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino and nephew of Pope Leo X, succumbed to illness soon after. The infant Catherine was left an orphan before she could even open her eyes to the dazzling but dangerous legacy of her family. In Florence, the Medici name was both shield and curse. They were the grand bankers of Europe, the patrons of Michelangelo and Botticelli, yet also the targets of assassins, conspiracies, and rebellions. For the citizens of Florence, Catherine was not merely a child. She was the embodiment of a dynasty they both revered and despised. And so, from the very start, her life was marked by instability. When the Medici fell temporarily from power, the young girl was placed in the care of convents. It was there, behind stone walls, that Catherine's character was forged. She was not raised in palaces, but among nuns, in cloisters where silence was the rule, and survival meant obedience. There, she learned to mask her emotions, to observe without speaking, to endure without breaking. These convent years, sometimes portrayed in legend as a gilded prison, would leave Catherine with a resilience that would define her reign as queen. The streets of Florence, meanwhile, whispered with venom. Rumors swirled that this little girl, this Medici orphan, might be better off dead than alive. At one point, during an uprising against the Medici, Catherine was reportedly dragged from the convent by rebels who debated her fate. Should she be killed to end the Medici line? In one dramatic retelling, the child was paraded on the city walls as a kind of bargaining tool, her life hanging in the balance of politics before she could even speak. Whether exaggerated or true, such stories revealed the precariousness of her youth. She was always a pawn in a larger game, but Catherine survived, and survival became her greatest skill. By the time the Medici were restored to Florence, the girl had already developed the iron will and cautious mind that would guide her in later years. It was during this period that her uncle, Pope Clement VII, recognized her value, not simply as a family member, but as a potential political weapon. For in 16th century Europe, royal women were currency, and Catherine, though not wealthy, carried the illustrious Medici bloodline. Clement VII, seeking to secure alliances, arranged her marriage to a French prince, Henri, Duke of Orleans, the second son of King Francis III of France. The match was not one of love, but of strategy, a bridge between papal Rome and the glittering court of France. In 1533, at the age of 14, Catherine left the convent walls and embarked on a journey that would change her life forever. Her bridal procession was a spectacle of Renaissance magnificence. Caravans of jewels, silks and tasseros and tapestries followed her to Marseille, where her marriage to Henri was celebrated with pomp and grandeur. It was said that even the fountains ran with wine that day, and that poets proclaimed her beauty as a gift to France. Yet beneath the music and pageantry, Catherine's position was perilous. She was an Italian foreigner in a French court that distrusted outsiders, and she brought with her no vast dowry, only a name both revered and feared. Her new husband, Henri, was young, reserved, and distant. More painfully, he was already devoted to another woman, Diane de Poitiers, a widow 20 years his senior, who would dominate his affections for decades. Catherine's wedding night was not the beginning of a romance, but the start of a lifelong struggle for influence. She was expected to produce heirs, but for 10 long years her womb remained barren. Courtiers mocked her, rivals whispered that she was cursed, and pamphlets suggested she was destined to bring misfortune to France. Desperate, Catherine turned to remedies both scientific and mystical. Physicians prescribed potions, astrologers charted her stars, alchemists offered charms. In one particularly vivid legend, she tried sleeping with strange herbal concoctions beneath her pillow, and even consulted occult rituals to break her infertility. The court saw a desperate young woman, but Catherine was absorbing something far more important, the language of survival in a hostile world. She learned when to flatter, when to stay silent, and when to wield her intelligence in secret. When, at last, she bore a child, a son, the future Francois VI. It seemed as though her prayers had been answered. More children followed, securing her position, but those long years of humiliation had marked her, teaching her that nothing in court was permanent, and that power was never freely given to women. It had to be seized, or else defended with tooth and nail. By the time Henri ascended the throne as Henri II in 1547, Catherine had transformed from an insecure young bride into a determined queen consort. She still remained in the shadow of Diane de Poitiers, her husband's mistress, but she had already mastered the art of patience. She was learning to watch, to wait, and to endure slights that might have broken a lesser woman. Her childhood of loss, convent walls, and political peril had hardened her into something else entirely. Not a fragile ornament of the court, but a steel blade wrapped in velvet. Behind her composed exterior, Catherine carried the lessons of Florence, the scars of survival, and the secret knowledge that destiny had placed her in France not to fade into obscurity, but to shape the kingdom's fate. For the girl who had once been paraded on Florence's walls as a pawn was destined to become the black-clad queen who would command France's most infamous era of blood and fire. When Henri II ascended the throne in 1547, Catherine de Medici became Queen of France. But her coronation did not come with the glittering power she might have imagined as a young girl in Florence. Instead, it came with shadows. Henri adored, not his wife, but his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, a woman of commanding presence and political skill, who wore the crown of influence without ever being crowned queen. Catherine, once again, was relegated to the margins, her throne an illusion. But if her childhood had taught Catherine anything, it was that patience was the sharpest weapon. She did not openly challenge Diane, nor did she sulk in corners. Instead, she learned to smile, to bow, to wait. She studied court politics with the precision of a surgeon, cataloging allies and enemies, listening to whispers, and carefully cultivating her children as her strongest hand in the game of dynastic survival. Her patience paid off by producing not just 1 or 2 heirs, but 10 children, 7 of whom survived into adulthood. Catherine accomplished the most vital duty of a queen, securing the royal line. Every child she bore was a living anchor, tying her to the future of France. If Diane was Henri's mistress, Catherine was the mother of France, and that gave her a power no courtly lover could rival. Catherine's rise was not only maternal, but also intellectual. She brought with her from Florence a taste for art, architecture, and spectacle. She commissioned grand festivals, masques, and tournaments that dazzled the court. Under her guidance, the French Renaissance flourished. She invited Italian artists and chefs to Paris, introducing innovations ranging from ballet to delicate pastries. Versailles would one day be famed for extravagance, but it was Catherine who first laid the seeds of theatrical monarchy, transforming power into performance. Yet, beneath the glitter, there was steel. Catherine was no naive patron of the arts. She understood the political theater behind every dance, every mask. A court spectacle was not merely entertainment, it was propaganda. She crafted images of her children as heirs of destiny, parading them before nobles, embedding in the minds of France the idea that the Valois line was eternal. The great turning point came in 1559, during a jousting tournament, celebrating the marriage of her daughter Elizabeth to the King of Spain. Henri II, proud and reckless, insisted on participating. Against Diane's pleas, he donned his armor and rode into the lists. In a fateful tilt, the lance of Gabriel de Montgomery shattered. a splinter piercing Henri's eye and brain. The king lingered in agony for 10 days, his mistress Diane forbidden from his bedside by Catherine herself. At last, Henri died, and France plunged into uncertainty. For Catherine, it was the moment she had waited for all her life. She was now the queen, mother of a boy, King François VII, barely 15 years old and sickly. Real power no longer belonged to a reigning king, but to the regent who guided him, and that regent was Catherine, yet her rise was immediately contested. François VII was married to Mary, Queen of Scots, niece of the powerful Guise family. The Guises sought to dominate the crown, pushing Catherine aside, but Catherine maneuvered with remarkable skill. She courted alliances, whispered promises, and above all, clung to her role as mother. No noble family, however mighty, could erase the simple truth. She was the queen who had borne the king. François II's reign was short, collapsing with his sudden death in 1560. Once again Catherine's fate shifted, but this time to her advantage. Her second son, Charles IX, was only 10 years old. Catherine seized the regency with both hands. France was fracturing under the strain of religious division between Catholics and Protestants, Huguenots, and many believed the kingdom would crumble. Catherine presented herself as the one steady force capable of holding France together. It was during these regency years that her reputation began to transform. No longer overshadowed, Catherine emerged as a formidable political player. She traveled across the realm with her young son, parading him before his subjects, forging alliances, and attempting to balance Catholic and Protestant factions. She negotiated with the Huguenots, offering limited concessions, while at the same time assuring Catholic loyalists that she remained their protector. Some admired her pragmatism, but many began to whisper darker tales. She was seen constantly dressed in black, mourning Henri II until her death. To her supporters, the black was a symbol of devotion. To her enemies, it was the uniform of a sorceress. She kept astrologers like Nostradamus in her service, reading the stars to guide her decisions. Rumors spread that she possessed a cabinet of poisons, that her rings contained secret compartments filled with venom, and that she consulted dark forces to secure her dynasty. The French court, always hungry for scandal, turned these rumors into myth. Catherine was no longer just the queen mother. She was becoming the Black Queen, a figure both feared and fascinating. Every sudden death at court was blamed on her poisons. Every unexpected turn of politics was credited to her schemes. Whether true or not, Catherine understood that fear was a form of power, and she did not rush to dispel the rumors. By the time Charles IX reached his majority, Catherine's grip on power was absolute. She was no longer the silent Italian bride overshadowed by Diane de Poitiers. She was the queen who ruled through her sons, the orchestrator of festivals and policies, the woman who could whisper a word and alter the fate of nobles and nations alike. Her rise to fame was not a dramatic burst of lightning, but a slow, inexorable climb, marked by patience, endurance, and ruthless cunning. She had waited in silence, endured humiliation, and survived uncertainty. Now at last, she stood where few women in European history had stood, at the very center of power, in control of a kingdom divided by faith and fire. But the higher Catherine climbed, the more precarious her position became. For with fame came suspicion, with influence came resentment, and with power came enemies. France was still a tinderbox of religious hatred, and one day soon, Catherine's decisions would set the entire nation aflame in blood. The years of Catherine de Medici's regency were a crucible of blood and fire. France in the mid-16th century was not a kingdom at peace, but a battlefield of faith. Catholics and Protestants, the Huguenots, tore at one another with a ferocity that threatened to shatter the Valois dynasty itself. And in the heart of the storm stood Catherine, the widow in black, the mother of kings, the woman many began to whisper about as the spider at the center of the web. Her ambition was simple, and yet impossibly difficult: to preserve her children's throne. To do this, Catherine attempted what seemed almost impossible: balance. She sought peace with the Huguenots at times, granting them limited tolerance under the Edict of Saint-Germain, but such concessions enraged Catholic hardliners who saw compromise as betrayal. And so, Catherine turned from one side to the other, negotiating, manipulating, promising, deceiving. It was a dangerous game, and with each move, she gained more enemies. To Catholics, she was too soft. To Protestants, she was treacherous. To both, she became the perfect villain. Every unexpected death at court, every sudden shift in power, was attributed to her hidden hand. The rumors grew like wildfire. People whispered of a secret laboratory where Catherine brewed poisons in glass vials. They said she owned books of dark magic, inherited from Italian necromancers, and that she anointed her children with talismans blessed or cursed by Nostradamus himself. Nobles swore that she possessed rings filled with venom, ready to twist from her finger into a rival's goblet. Whether truth or fiction, these tales wrapped themselves around her like a cloak, feeding her image as the Black Queen. Her enemies had fuel enough to believe the worst. Catherine's most infamous moment of darkness came in 1572, at the wedding of her daughter Marguerite de Valois to Henri of Navarre, a Protestant noble who would one day become King Henri IV. The union was meant to be a gesture of reconciliation between Catholics and Protestants, a fragile truce sealed with vows and celebration. But Paris was a tinderbox, and Catherine, fearful of losing control, lit the match. In the early hours of August 24th, St. Bartholomew's Day, church bells rang across the city. Armed bands, directed by Catholic leaders and tacitly approved by the crown, swept through the streets. They hunted Protestants door to door, dragging men, women, and children into the open, cutting them down with swords and knives. The Seine ran red with blood, corpses piled in alleys. The massacre spread beyond Paris, engulfing towns across France. Historians still debate how deeply Catherine was involved, but to her enemies, and to history, she was the mastermind. The image was too powerful to resist. The Black Queen orchestrating slaughter, whispering orders in shadowed corridors, while her son Charles the Neve trembled at her side. Charles himself was said to have been haunted by guilt, his health collapsing as nightmares of the massacre plagued him. Catherine's influence, once seen as protective, was now cast as diabolical. She was not saving France, she was destroying it. As the wars of religion raged on, Catherine's world grew darker. Her beloved son Charles IX died in 1574, coughing blood, his body ruined by tuberculosis and torment. On his deathbed, he's said to have muttered that his mother was cursed, that the massacre had doomed them all. Catherine wept, but her grief was laced with grim determination. Another son still remained. Henri III took the throne, and once again, Catherine tightened her grip. But the France Henri III inherited was fractured beyond repair. The Catholic League, led by the powerful Guise family, demanded total war on Protestants. The Huguenots fought back with equal ferocity. Catherine's endless balancing act was collapsing. She tried to mediate, to maneuver, but her old tactics had lost their magic. Her enemies no longer feared her in the same way. They despised her. The nickname Italian Poisoner became her permanent brand. Catherine also faced betrayal within her own bloodline. Her daughter Marguerite of Valois, the same who had been married to Henri of Navarre, turned against her family in a swirl of scandal and intrigue. The Valois dynasty seemed cursed, its members tangled in affairs, betrayals, and rivalries. Catherine, once the great matriarch, was left to play peacemaker in a family tearing itself apart, as if fate itself conspired against her. Catherine's health began to fail in the 1580s. Once a tireless traveler who rode across France on horseback well into her 50s, she now suffered from arthritis and exhaustion. Yet even weakened, she continued to plot, to negotiate, to cling to the thread of power that had defined her life. She was like a shadow that refused to leave the palace halls, a widow who would never surrender. But the world had moved on. The last years of Catherine's life were filled with humiliation. Her once feared name became a curse on the lips of the people. To Catholics, she was the mother of weak kings who betrayed the faith. To Protestants, she was the butcher of Paris. To both she was the Black Queen, an eternal villainess. Perhaps the cruelest downfall was not her loss of political influence, but the collapse of the dynasty she had fought so desperately to preserve. Her sons, François I, Charles IX, and Henri III, each failed. The Valois line would end with Henri III's assassination in 1589, just months after Catherine's death. She had fought, schemed, poisoned, and prophesied, but in the end, her greatest fear was realized. She'd preserved nothing. In a sense, Catherine's downfall was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, suffocating descent. Each rumor, each massacre, each death of a child was a thread pulled from her web, until the once mighty queen was left clinging to power in name only. She had risen to become the mother of kings, the architect of dynastic survival, but in the end, she became something else, a figure of horror, a living ghost haunting her own court. Her legacy was already taking shape in her lifetime, painted, not in marble or gold, but in shadows and whispers. Catherine de Medici had transformed from queen mother to legendary villain, a woman condemned as much by rumor as by reality, and though she would cling to power until her final breath, she could not stop the tide of history that was already sweeping her into the realm of myth. Catherine de Medici's final years were a slow march toward tragedy, not with the sudden violence of an execution or assassination, but with the crushing weight of inevitability. Her entire life had been a struggle to hold together a crumbling dynasty, to protect her sons against the chaos of France's religious wars. Yet by the late 1580s, she was watching the Valois crown slip inexorably into dust. The climax of her story unfolded not in one single act, but in a series of blows that struck with relentless cruelty, each one more devastating than the last. It was as if fate itself had conspired to humiliate the Black Queen, stripping away the illusions of her power and leaving only despair. In 1588, the French court was a powder keg. King Henri III, Catherine's last surviving son on the throne, was surrounded by enemies. The Catholic League, led by the fanatical Duke of Guise, held Paris in its grip. The Huguenots, led by Henri of Navarre, fought bitterly in the south. Catherine, weary and ill, tried to mediate once more, traveling across France despite her age and infirmities. Eyewitnesses described her arrival in towns like a ghostly procession, the once magnificent Queen Mother now hunched in her carriage, her face pale beneath the weight of mourning veils, her eyes still sharp but hollowed by exhaustion. But even Catherine's presence could not save her son from catastrophe. In December of that year, Henri III, desperate to break free from the Guise family's control, ordered the assassination of the Duke of Guise and his brother, the Cardinal. The murders were carried out brutally, their bodies left bleeding on the floors of Blois Castle. The act shocked France, not only because it shattered political alliances, but because it bore the unmistakable signature of Valois treachery, the same kind of shadowy violence that had long been attributed to Catherine herself. For once, however, Catherine was not the mastermind. In fact, she was horrified. When news of the assassinations reached her, she said to have murmured, "God grant us peace, we are ruined." For all her ruthlessness, Catherine understood the weight of blood spilled. She knew the killings would unleash fury upon her son and doom the fragile Valois hold on power. And she was right. The Catholic League declared Henri III a tyrant. Paris rose in revolt, and the crown Catherine had fought so fiercely to protect was teetering on the brink. The irony was cruel. For decades, she had been accused of orchestrating murders, and now at the very end, her son had committed the act that sealed their fate without her. By now, Catherine was gravely ill, weakened by age and years of ceaseless political struggle. She could barely stand without assistance. In January 1589, she lay bedridden in the Château de Blois, racked by pleurisy. Those who saw her described a woman transformed, no longer the imperious Black Queen, but a frail widow consumed by pain, coughing blood into her linens. And yet, even in her final hours, she never abandoned politics. From her bed, she dictated letters, gave instructions, and begged her son to reconcile with Henri of Navarre. "Make peace with him," she said to have whispered, "for he alone can save France." But her advice went unheeded. On January 5, 1589, Catherine de Medici breathed her last. She died not with a dramatic flourish, but quietly, almost anticlimactically. Her body exhausted from 70 years of battle, personal, political, and spiritual. She was 70 years old, having outlived most of her children, her enemies, and even her reputation. Yet, in death, the tragedy only deepened. Catherine had longed to be buried beside her husband, King Henri VIII, in the Grand Basilica of Saint-Denis, the necropolis of French royalty. But Paris, still in revolt, was closed to her. Her body was laid temporarily in Blois, and only later, years later, was it transferred to Saint-Denis. By then, her legacy was already blackened, her name synonymous with poison, massacre, and manipulation. And the ultimate cruelty? Only 7 months after her death, her last son, King Henri III, was assassinated by a fanatical monk. The Valois dynasty, which Catherine had sacrificed everything to protect, ended with him. All her schemes, all her balancing acts, all her whispered bargains in shadowed corridors, they had brought only delay, not salvation. The crown passed to Henri of Navarre, who became Henri IV, the first king of the Bourbon dynasty. Catherine's line, her blood, her dynasty, gone. This was the tragedy of Catherine de Medici, not that she was killed or toppled, but that she lost everything she had fought for. She had worn the mask of power for decades, but behind it was the despair of a mother who watched her sons die one by one, who saw her family name become a curse, who realized too late that even she could not command the tide of history. And yet, the myths surrounding her death transformed it into something larger, more haunting. In Paris, pamphlets circulated claiming that Catherine's soul had been dragged to hell by demons, that the devil himself had come to collect the poisoner queen. Others swore her ghost wandered the halls of Blois, forever whispering, forever plotting, forever unable to rest. The image of the Black Queen lived on, stronger than the frail woman who had truly died in her bed. Her climax, then, was not her death, but her transformation into legend. The real Catherine was buried, forgotten, overshadowed by the Catherine of myth, the sorceress, the poisoner, the orchestrator of massacre. That was the tragedy. Her truth lost, her image eternal. Catherine de Medici's legacy is one of paradoxes, both magnificent and monstrous. To some, she remains the Black Queen, a shadowed figure who poisoned her enemies, whispered with demons, and drenched France in blood. To others, she was a pragmatic stateswoman, a survivor in a world where mercy was weakness, who struggled desperately to hold together a kingdom riven by hatred. Between these two portraits lies the enduring fascination of Catherine. Was she a villain or a victim of circumstance? Her enemies painted her as a sorceress. Pamphlets in Paris depicted her brewing poisons in hidden laboratories, consulting crystal balls, and employing astrologers to bend fate itself. The infamous Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, though the result of a convergence of political and religious tensions, was branded as her orchestration. It was convenient to place the blame on the Italian Queen Mother, the foreigner, the woman. Catherine became a scapegoat, her name forever linked with massacre. But historians who peel back the layers of propaganda see another side. Catherine inherited a broken kingdom after her husband's sudden death, a France splintered between Catholic and Protestant, where every decision risked civil war. She ruled not with unchecked power, but with constant compromise, walking a knife's edge between factions. Her correspondence reveals not delight in cruelty, but exhaustion, fear, and calculation. She was no saint, but neither was she the monster of legend. Still, it is the legend that endures. Literature and art have preserved the darker Catherine, from Alexandre Dumas' tales of poisons and plots to operas that cast her as a Machiavellian schemer. Popular imagination prefers the Black Queen to the weary matriarch. There is something irresistible about a woman wielding power in an age of men, something frightening about her resilience, something almost supernatural about her survival. And, yet, beneath the black legend, Catherine left real marks on history. She was a patron of architecture and art, commissioning the Tuileries Palace in Paris and nurturing Renaissance culture in France. She fostered diplomacy across Europe. Even as her kingdom tore itself apart, her children may have failed as kings, but she ensured that France did not disintegrate entirely before the Bourbons rose to power. Her reign was one of delay, not defeat, and in that delay lay the survival of the French state. Her reflection is thus complex. She was not loved, rarely admired, and often feared, but she was indispensable in the chaos of the 16th century. Catherine de Medici embodied the iron will required to hold a crumbling dynasty together, even if it meant wearing the mask of cruelty. Today, her name still carries the chill of poison and prophecy, but perhaps the true tragedy of Catherine is that she was never allowed to be remembered as a mother, a widow, or a builder of peace. She became instead a symbol, the embodiment of the dark feminine power that haunted Europe's imagination. Her story lingers, because it asks an unsettling question. When history remembers a woman in power, does it ever remember her fairly, or does it always turn her into myth, a monster, or a queen in black?